So our next session will be a keynote address by the Minister of Tourism of the Government of Saint Vincent and the Grenadines, the Honorable Carlos James. Welcome to the stage.
Thank you very much. And let me welcome everyone who is here today. Thank you very much, Chair, Excellencies, distinguished guests. Let me express gratitude to Island Innovation and Climate Action for hosting this very timely and important event on the margins of the 28th Conference of the Parties. I would like to share some insights on the impacts of climate change on sustainable developing and small island developing states, our Caribbean experiences, and the way forward for sustainable tourism development for island states in the global context. There are those who question the science behind climate change, but it underscores the point that certainly more resources are needed to capture adequate and reliable data and build out scientific research on the particular subject matter. We must take into account the best available science, and the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change warned that unless there are immediate and deep emissions reductions across all sectors, limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius will be beyond reach. On the contrast, fossil fuel subsidies surged to a record 7 trillion last year. As the world struggles to restrict global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius and parts of Asia, Europe, and the Americas swelter in extreme heat, subsidies for oil, coal, and natural gas are costing equivalent of 7.1% of global GDP. That's more than governments spend annually on education, and about 2/3 of what they spend on healthcare. What's more interesting, 75 billion is spent on the Russia-Ukraine crisis, and the Gaza conflict will cost an average of 51 billion, while we just heard loss and damage the fund only stands around 420 million in terms of capitalization. And this is in fact our biggest threat, climate change, our biggest global threat. Another point, interestingly, COP should be about inclusion. And while we welcome oil and gas executives to the table, we are seeing some island states being left out of the discussion. Take a look at the innovations being used in places like Taiwan. I've visited and I've seen what they're doing. They have legislated climate action through a Climate Change Response Act. They're taking bold and daring initiatives to reduce their emissions. And of course, it's time for us to move the discussion on climate action beyond geopolitical differences and bring everyone to the discussion and negotiating table. I want to now go into tourism and climate change and its impact, particularly in the context of our Caribbean region. We in the Caribbean attract some 28 million visitors just last year alone. And many of our small island economies are more reliant on travel and tourism, even now more than before, in terms of pre-pandemic period. Our small coastlines are seeing sea level rises of 10% than the global average, leaving over 60 to 80% of coastal tourism infrastructure at risk from sea level rise. Carbon emissions from tourism are forecasted to increase by 25% by 2030 from our 2016 levels. Against the current ambition scenario, therefore, the need to scale up climate action in tourism remains urgent. Another important point for us as small island states, we look at coral bleaching. Increasing droughts are already impacting the region's tourism potential. Damage and loss caused by storms and hurricanes has also risen. Major tourism infrastructure, including seaports and airports, are at risk from a 1 millimeter rise in sea level. The cost of rebuilding damaged infrastructure located along the coastline is disproportionately high for Caribbean small island developing states. According to the World Bank, by the year 2050, coastal flooding with a sea level rise of 20 centimeters generate approximately 940 million of mean annual losses in the Caribbean region, which is the most dependent region on tourism. Our islands race to develop into tourism economies. This must be done in a sustainable way and an environmentally friendly way. And these are some of the measures that we ought to look at. One of the important things I'd want to mention here is that while the Sustainable Development Goals, we agree that there are indirect links to tourism and the SDGs. The UNWTO also promotes that narrative. But there has to be a greater carve-out that connects directly tourism as a direct source of income for developing states and small island territories, linking it to our sustainable development agenda. Take, for instance, how do we move persons to our islands? Airlift. Airlift and Atlantic flights using sustainable aviation fuel gives an impressive reduction of up to 80% in carbon emissions over a life cycle of the fuel compared to traditional jet fuel, which it replaces. How much of the civil aviation industry is focusing on moving faster and quicker to the transition to sustainable aviation fuel? These are some of the questions we have to ask. Mandatory requirements for the cruise industry to move faster towards transitional biofuel and later zero-emission engines. What is the investment uptake for the cruise industry in moving robustly to transitioning to biofuel and zero-emission engines? Is the investment sharp and fast enough? These are the two main modes of transportation for having persons come to our islands. And we have to look at how, firstly, we can address those issues of carbon emissions by travel within the tourism industry. Modern ports of entry must include solar and geothermal energy as part of the sustainable tourism build-out. If we're not investing in renewables, the high energy consumption at ports is a contributing factor to what we see as a high rise in carbon emissions. We have to be able to accommodate not just vessels and aircraft that are using transitionary fuel, but also these ports of entry must also reflect that in promoting a more sustainable and environmentally friendly way of using energy. Building codes for hotels and accommodation that limits high-rise buildings. Particular attention to mandatory requirements for hotel developments to include at least 50 to 100% of energy to be derived from renewables. How many times have we seen on the coastlines of Caribbean beaches, high-rise buildings using electricity, not focusing on solar or renewables, building codes that are not properly linked to how we protect our marine coastlines, our marine ecosystems, leakage of grey water into our environment. All of these things have an impact, an adverse impact on our environment, and we have to look at how we can develop sustainably in putting all of these policy and measures in place. Promoting ecotourism best practices, moving from mass tourism to having greater focus on how we can invite persons, reducing our carbon footprint, but having sufficient number of persons to enjoy our ecotourism build-out. Promoting the build-out of protected areas and marine parks. In Saint Vincent and the Grenadines, we have one of the, perhaps in the Southern Caribbean, a marine park. We also have protected areas in which we focus on our ecosystem. And there are the Caribbean islands that has that focus and moving into that direction. But we have to do so in a much more aggressive way to ensure we protect our environment. Banning of certain chemical substances in sunblocks to reduce coral bleaching. A sustainable tax on visitors who use our island resources, in addition to tax captured on visitor expenditure. Limiting our carbon footprint to some of our islands, for those of us who have multi-island states. And of course, reducing leakage, reduction of imports, and promoting local consumption. These are some of the steps that we have to take. And I want to give a real-life scenario as to what is taking place within our Caribbean region. 22 largest coastline cities within Latin America and the Caribbean region. And about 1.2 billion within the sea level rise of 40 centimeters. Let's look at some of the impacts. Warmer temperatures. The tourism implications naturally will see altered seasonality, heat stress, cooling costs, infectious diseases, increase in frequency of and intensity of extreme storms, risk of tourism facilities, insurance costs, and business interruptions, changes to precipitation, water shortages, desertification, and all of these challenges as it relates to our natural resources. Sea level rise, naturally, coastal erosion, loss of beach area, cost to maintain and protected areas and defenses and waterfronts, changes in biodiversity, loss of natural attractions. In the Caribbean region, we spend roughly an average over 30–40% of our capital estimates, our expenditure, dealing with issues relating to loss and damage, adaptation, coastal and sea defenses, putting in place measures to protect our environment against climate change. Tourism, which is our main economic driver, also has that significant impact that we see from the adverse implications of climate change. Linkage to the sector is also at risk. Fisheries, agriculture are important linkage sectors for tourism, and impacts which hamper the tourism industry negatively would also have a domino effect on these sectors if we don't address the issues of food insecurity by extended periods of drought. The good news is that livelihoods of many local persons who work in these sectors, we must protect them, and we must do so now. We have to protect the environment in our efforts of harnessing the blue economy, and not just exploiting the blue economy, but harnessing the revenue expenditure, the revenues that we can see deriving from the blue economy. Investment in research and data gathering systems, such as early warning systems, greater relationship between meteorologists, climatologists, scientists, and all other sectors and policymakers is one of the critical things we have to look at in addressing this climate issue in terms of developing a sustainable tourism policy. Across the region, there needs to be an increase in data collection, research into specific impacts of climate change as it relates to tourism. And as I conclude, Ridge to reef ecosystems or integrated management approach, addressing issues of greywater leakage from coastal infrastructure and hotels into our marine ecosystems is something we have to address. Our global environmental benchmarks must be set and developed in a way that is sustainable, that is eco-friendly, and that promotes the well-being of lives and livelihoods within small island developing states. While there is this rush to move towards tourism as a main economic driver for many small island developing states, I've highlighted here some of the implications, the challenges, but also some of the measures and the policy and initiatives that we ought to take to develop a sustainable tourism policy that protects our environment, protects our ecosystem, protect lives and livelihoods of small island developing states, which are critical to our development as a region, but also as OASIS member states. I want to urge this conference of parties, discussions of this nature on the margins, as well as the UN WTO, to look at ways in which we can set out a framework for developing a sustainable tourism policy for island states. It is critical to our development. It is critical to how we coexist and how we compete competitively within the global framework. And we must look at a sustainable development policy in how we advance tourism within small island economies globally. I want to thank you, and I wish the organizers of this event every success in the future activities as we plan during this COP conference. Thank you very much.